Hello, everybody, and welcome to Forensics Talks. This is episode 25. Before we get started with our guest today, just a couple of quick things here, and I'm going to make sure that I get this all organized on my screen. I need to share something here, so hang tight. And the first thing is that we had a very successful photogrammetry week, the photogrammetry course that we ran recently, and so we are running it again. But we're starting off with photogrammetry week, which is going to be on April 6th through 8th, and it's a series of free webinars talking about photogrammetry. There'll be 3 webinars that week. The first one is going to be on the fundamentals of photogrammetry, what it is, how it works sort of under the hood. The second one is going to be talking about the equipment and software and how you can use it to document things, whether it's small object or larger objects, how to take photos, if you're working with drones, that kind of thing. And then finally, the last one is on actually application. So how you may use it in forensics, how you might use it in accident reconstruction, whether it's for engineering, architecture, and that sort of thing. I'll also be doing some software demonstrations on that last webinar. So if you're interested, just go to my website, just AI23D. Let me bring it up here. And if you go to /photo week, you can just register for that and you'll get a confirmation email and all the rest of the information. Each one of the webinars is going to be about an hour to an hour and a half. I haven't set a hard stop just because sometimes there's a lot of questions and that sort of thing, and I like to keep it interactive. So keep that in mind, and hopefully we'll see you there. Also, the Canadian Society of Forensic Science is going to be having a conference the week of June 21st. And this is brand new. They don't even have anything on their website because it's literally just been decided, and I'm on the organizing committee. So if you are interested, pay attention to the csfs.ca website. You'll be hearing more about that. It's going to be about 4 days long, and speakers from all over. And I think there's going to be some small talks in the mornings and things like that. So anyway, I'll talk more about it later on, and hopefully that's something that will interest you as well. Okay, let's get started with an introduction for our guest. And so it's Professor Caroline Wilkinson, and she received her Master's of Philosophy from University of Manchester in 1998. She had her PhD in facial anthropology from the University of Manchester from 1996 to 2001. And from 2000 to 2005, she led the Unit of Art in Medicine at the University of Manchester. And there she was developing 3D computerized facial reconstruction systems and things like that for use in forensic and archaeological disciplines. From 2005 to 2014, she was at the University of Dundee, and she was the head of human identification, doing a lot of work with craniofacial reconstructions. And from 2014 to the present, she's the director of the Face Lab at Liverpool John Moores University School of Art and Design. And so she's doing a lot of depiction and identification of unknown bodies for forensic investigation. She's also well known for a lot of the historical figures that she's worked on. She's also written a book on forensic facial reconstruction back in 2004, and I'll be asking her about some of the more famous reconstructions that she's done, like Robert the Bruce, Richard III, and even Robert Burns. So on that note, let's bring her in here. Hi, Caroline. How are you today?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you very much. So I was thinking about this, and I thought, you know what? She's got like one of the coolest jobs in the world, because you put anything on forensic facial reconstruction on the internet and just people flock to it, right? So, so how did you get started in this? What drove you in this area?
Well, it's not an obvious career path, is it really? So, I mean, to be honest, I didn't really know anything about it until quite late on. So I studied physiology and anatomy first. And whilst I was doing that, I kind of decided that I wanted to do something that involved art, and I'd never really left my art behind. I'd kind of continued as I was studying my degree. And one of my tutors said, "Oh, you should go and meet Richard Neve, who's like in the top corner of the medical school," which is where I was studying. And I kind of went up to this like little artist space right at the top of the medical school that I just thought was amazing, and got to know Richard Neve. And then kind of asked him, about his work, got really interested in it, and then I kind of just pestered him until he gave me the job, really. I mean, it's serendipity, really, because I happened to be a student in Manchester that I got involved, because Richard was really the only person who was doing this kind of work in the UK at the time.
Wow. And you did, well, it's an interesting blend of art and science, right, in terms of what you do. So do you consider yourself more of an artist than a scientist? What do you consider yourself?
That's an interesting question. I think it depends where I'm working as to how I'm considered, really, because, as you mentioned in your introduction, the last place I worked in the University of Dundee was very much a science department. It was the Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification. But we had this quite strong link with the art school in the university, which is how I got involved, really. But now I work in an art school and I'm more linked up to the kind of science world. So for me, nothing changes. I do the same thing wherever I am, and it's a combination of art and science. But how I'm judged by those around me depends on the department that I'm working in. So I think within the art world, I'm considered a bit of a freak, and I think in the science world, probably the same. But I seem to cross just as easily between those areas, so it's fine by me, whichever.
Right. And I was in looking at this, and I've been doing some research the past while, papers and things like this. I imagine this area of craniofacial reconstruction has grown, but it doesn't sound like it's a very big community. It sounds like all the players know each other. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's probably fair. And we have an international meeting every couple of years, which is the International Association of Craniofacial Identification. And we meet every couple of years, or sometimes it's a bit more than that. And there's usually between 50 and 100 people at that conference. So that tells you how few people there are in the specialism. However, that is mostly the Western world. So we do get people from China, and we've had people from other parts of Asia, but I'd say it's poorly represented in terms of other areas outside of the West. So there may well be more people that we don't know who are working in less accessible areas to us. But certainly within the Western world, you tend to know most people in the field, it's true.
Well, I noticed that a lot of the papers, there's a lot of South Korean people who are doing a lot of work in this area. Is there a reason for that?
I don't know if there's a particular reason. I mean, we've had a long connection with South Korea in terms of my departments where I've worked, and one of my ex-PhD students was from South Korea, Wonjun Lee, who's now in South Korea in Seoul working. So maybe it's him that's taken it there and spread it from that field, really. But I think it's certainly a growing area there for sure.
Right. Well, let's get into it then. A question I have is, you often talk about the importance of the face, right? And what we can learn about people or each other about just by looking at one another. And so there's this interesting relationship between the face and the skull. And that's when the more I've dealt, this is not my area, right? So I love 3D, all things 3D. I love scanning. I love, all those sort of things, doing comparisons. So it all makes sense to me, but I'm not an anthropologist. So as I read into this, I think of what you're doing as always drawing this relationship between the face, the surface of the face, and the skull. Is that fair to say? Like there's this battle, not a battle, but a connection between the two.
Yeah. So the two things really are directly related to each other. I think we used to think that the skull was like an armature that the flesh hung off. Actually, I think now we're more of the opinion that they each influence each other and change each other. So changes to the soft tissue will change the bony structure and vice versa. The changes that soft tissues have on the bony structures is less quick for sure, but certainly it does affect you. So if you build up your muscles, for example, then you'll get stronger muscle attachments on the bone, and the bone will change to accommodate that. And if you change the bone or you change your teeth, then that will change the shape of the face. So they're intrinsically connected to each other.
Right. In terms of when you're doing a reconstruction, for whatever purpose, whether it's forensic or archaeological or historical, whatever it may be, the like what would you consider to be some of the most important information to receive, which would be helpful in making a more accurate reconstruction?
Well, the more the better, really, in terms of accuracy and reliability. I mean, the skull is the most important thing. So, and having an intact skull will always get you a much better result than if you've got bits missing or it's fragmented. So the more teeth there are, the more of the skull there is, the better the reconstruction. On top of that, then, additional information is always really helpful, because I think although we're pretty confident in our ability to predict shape from skeletal analysis, it's the additional texture, what we call texture information, that is actually really important for recognition. So if we have information like hair color or skin color or eyes or body shape, all of those things are really important when it comes to recognition, and we have no way of knowing that from the skeleton. So it depends on the state of the human remains that are found as to how much of that information we get, and whether the police have found, if it's a forensic case, whether the police have found any additional information with the body.
Is there anything that you can say, or does it help to refine the reconstruction if, for example, that the person was found is South Korean, or their race, or that sort of thing? Like, are the facial markers, are we at the point where we can say that we know that for example, Caucasians are a certain way, or people from Africa are another way, are built slightly differently?
So anatomically, we're all the same under the skin surface. There's no difference. We do have some standards that we use for predicting facial features that vary for different origin groups, for different populations. So, for example, we've got some measurements of the nasal aperture that we use, and we use regression formulae to tell us about measurements of the soft nose. Well, there's a slightly different set of regression formulae for Black Africans than there are for white Europeans.
Right.
But actually, those things are minute. If you just have the skull and you work from anatomical standards, then you should get the face shape, regardless of what else you know about somebody. And actually, many of those things that we talk about in terms of race are really surface information that we wouldn't necessarily know from the skeleton.
Okay. Yeah, there's been some things in the media or in the news lately, the past couple of years, about how DNA can help to, give you the shape of a person's face, a suspect's face, for example. They leave some trace DNA, and they can go back and say this is what the person might look like just based on their DNA. But if you do have their DNA, what kinds of things are important to you to pull out of the DNA profile?
Well, so certainly those things that I've just mentioned, like skin color, hair color, eye color, ancestry, if that's available, that can be really important. And the more refined DNA gets, the more information we may get. So, for example, someone might have a gene for going bald, having a balding pattern, and that would be really useful if we know the person's age to be past that, where someone might go bald. So all of those things could be useful, but useful is not the same as definitive. So knowing that somebody has blonde hair doesn't really tell you what they looked like at the point when they died.
Yeah,
so
sure.
We don't know how someone wore their hair. We don't know if they colored it. I mean, sometimes when I give talks, especially to students, there can be only like one or two of us in the room who have got a natural hair color, because this isn't my natural hair. So, knowing someone's natural hair color doesn't necessarily help in a forensic investigation at all,
Right.
in terms of recognition and identification. And then there's all those other things. So even if you do know somebody, I had a forensic case that I did once when I was in Scotland, and we knew the person's hair length, we knew what type of hair it was, and we knew how it was cut, because that was with the preserved remains. And yet we didn't know how that person wore their hair. So the reconstruction that was done with, it was a shoulder length, long, dark brown hair. That's what she was given. Actually, when she was eventually identified, her family said that she always wore her hair tied up at the back. And that makes a huge difference.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So even knowing information from DNA doesn't necessarily help with the recognition and identification aspect.
Because you made an
archaeology, then that's really important.
Right.
That's incredibly valuable to have that information within the world of archaeology, where it's less important to be perfectly correct and more important to be suggestive.
You made an interesting point about, for example, coloring your hair. And I'm wondering, as people progress in age, is it more difficult to do a reconstruction on, let's say, like a 70 or 80-year-old person than it is to do it on a 10-year-old, for example?
Oh, now, okay, so 10-year-old and 8-year-old, they're quite extreme. So I would say that very definitely it's more difficult to do an 8-year-old reconstruction than a 20-year-old. So within adult age group, the more age-related changes there are to the face, the more we have to guess, really.
I see.
We know how faces change, and actually we know how different face shapes age. But what we don't know is when that happens during someone's life. So I'm sure everybody knows a 60-year-old who looks amazing and looks like a 40-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
Or alternatively, a 40-year-old who's bloody awful and looks like a 70-year-old. We all know those people, and that how quickly they age will be determined by their lifestyle and their genetic inheritance and all of those things. So we're guessing really when it comes to aging faces in a reconstruction sense. Right. So as a 20-year-old will be a whole lot more accurate, where we're not making any of those guesses than an 8-year-old. 10-year-old different because children look a lot like each other. They don't really develop their distinctive face until 8 or 9 years of age. And girls and boys look very similar before puberty. So I'd say children, they're not really difficult, but they're probably not as straightforward as a young adult.
Right. In terms of the methods which are employed to do a reconstruction, is there just one method and everybody employs the same method, or are there various methods?
Well, I wish everyone did employ the same method. It would be easier. It's difficult to answer that question. I think there are a lot of standards out there that people can follow, and there's plenty of books out there that lay out the standards that people can follow. The problem is, I think that people have different approaches to how they work, not necessarily the method they use, but how they work. So, for example, in North America, it's much more common for people to use physical skulls and work either directly onto a physical skull or a cast of a skull. Whereas I'd say in my department, we do 97% is digital. Now we do everything non-invasively. Mm-hmm. We do everything within our 3D computer system. So I think that makes a real difference as to how methodology can be applied if you don't necessarily have the same resources available to do it. And then I think there are different approaches in terms of what standards people use. So I think there's two trains of thought really within my field. One is that we can only really produce an approximate type and not a characteristic face. And that tends to be, those practitioners tend to use a lot more average data and maybe automated systems, and are producing maybe 3 or 4 faces that might apply to the same skull. And then there's the area that I think I fit into, whereas we're trying to get the characteristic face for that skull, that there's only one, and that's the one we're trying to get for that particular skull. Now, we might not have all of the resources to get it exactly right yet, but that's what we're aiming for. We're not trying to get a type, we're trying to get that person. Right. And that uses less averages and relies more on the characteristic detail of that particular skull.
Right. So
does that explain?
Yeah, no, I think it does. I'm curious about some of the reconstructions that I've seen. Sometimes they're better than others, right? So sometimes you look at some and they're like, hey, it's not bad. Like you can get close, and then some are like, it's a little bit of a stretch trying to for me anyway. It may be a little bit of a stretch. So when looking at the human face. So, for example, if there's if I make small changes, so if I have a photo, let's say of you or myself or whatever, and I start moving things by, you know, a millimeter here or a millimeter here, and then I keep pushing that, whatever, there's going to be a point where I feel like it's no longer me, right? Or it's no longer you. And
Yeah.
so I guess the question would be, how tolerant are we to changes in the face, or I mean, humans got to be, we have to be pretty good at recognizing faces overall. But how has anyone ever done any kind of a study on how well we can recognize and how tolerant we are to changes in the face?
Yeah, so facial recognition is one of the most studied areas of psychology. So psychologists have been doing this for many decades now, looking at how and how tolerant we are to changes in faces in terms of recognition. And it's not a simple answer, really. I'm not sure the answers are fully there yet.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, we all think we're very good at recognizing faces. And we are very good at recognizing faces of people we know very well. We're not as good as we think we are at recognizing people that we've only seen an image of once, or that have only met very briefly.
Yeah.
So, and psychologists seem to agree right now that how we recognize faces that we know very well is different from how we recognize faces that we've only seen a few times. So, and I think you can probably see that when you think about people you know very well in your mind, you can think about their face in lots of different ways. Whereas if you think about someone you just met once today, if we ever meet new people again in our lives out of lockdown, but if you imagine meeting someone new for the first time and then thinking of their face, then you tend to get a much more blurry, holistic view of their face in your mind, rather than the ability to look at lots of different ways for somebody you know very well.
Yeah.
But what we're aiming for in a forensic setting are the people who know the person very well. It's them that we want to recognize the individual.
Right.
In that sense, something that matches up, some small thing that matches up might be enough to get a recognition. On the other hand, they might be less tolerant to huge change within that face because they know the person so very well. So I still don't know the answer to the question really in terms of this work, because what we're trying to do is to get a recognition that in a forensic sense, that's all we're aiming for. In a sense, it doesn't really matter whether it looks like the person or not. And it does to me as a practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot, but in the forensic case, it doesn't matter. It's just about getting a recognition and then getting that person identified. So if we could do that with just one single feature, then that's what we do. But at the moment, but we're actually unsure what it is often that people recognize in those depictions.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because even if you think of, for example, if people make a caricature of Donald Trump, right, you immediately know it's him because of the hair or whatever, even though it's not him. I mean, it's a very deformed, but sometimes exaggerating certain features. It's like, yeah, you know, it's him. And I believe in some of your presentations, you use Stephen Fry, use, for example, a 3D scan of his face, and it's like, you know, it's him. I mean, there's no denying it. It's so revealing, even though there's no texture or anything.
And that's true, actually. So the question you asked earlier about what information you ideally want, well, characteristic detail is the thing that we're looking for. So so Stephen Fry is very recognizable. Mm-hmm. He's got quite a distinctive face. He's got big features. He's got a broken nose. He's got a really distinctive face. So even without texture, he's recognizable in terms of shape because it's so distinctive. And that's what the ideal world, all our forensic cases would have enormous noses or big chins or, something really unusual about their face, because that will help to get them recognized. And that's what we're looking for, is that characteristic detail with each one that we find. Sadly, most of us are closer to the average. And so it's pulling out those recognizable things that's the important thing to do. Because you're right, caricatures. I think that studies that have been done with caricatures, that caricatures will get recognized more quickly than the actual photograph of the individual.
That's an interesting point. That's a very interesting point. So
Yeah.
let me, I mean, you scanned, or you had a scan of Stephen Fry's face. And Stephen Fry, if you ever listen, it's we love you. Okay, so don't worry. How have 3D technologies transformed the area you work in? Because it seems like you're heavily dependent on a lot of these technologies.
Yeah, hugely, really. When I think about when I first started out in Manchester, we were only using clay on plaster copies of the skull. I'm so old. We didn't even have computers in those days. So now things have moved on so massively. And as I said before, we very rarely use old manual techniques anymore, except for teaching students, because it's a valuable way of learning. Everything else is done in a 3D computer system. So that system you can see on the screen has a haptic device. So that arm that the person is holding gives touch to the person holding the arm. So as we're working in the 3D computer system, we have a 3D skull. We can feel the surface of the skull in the computer that we're touching, which, just blows my mind. If you told me I'd be doing that, 25 years ago, I would never have believed it. So, I mean, the advances in technology are amazing. And that allows us to do things we weren't able to do before. So I'd actually say that with our computer system, things are more accurate now than they used to be, because we can make things transparent. We can go back and look at detail. We can keep checking things all the time in the computer. When we were doing it with clay, once you'd covered the skull up, it's very difficult to go back and check what you've done because you've covered it up. So it's actually much better for a lot of that work. And then, of course, we don't have to be invasive. We can scan a skull, or even take from a CT scan of a body that's found with soft tissue as well as skeletal structure. We can take all of that into our computer without ever being in the same room as the human remains. So with Richard III, I've never been in the same room as his remains at all, but I've handled his skull, I've touched it in our computer system. And that's cool, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Actually, let me show you something. So, I don't know why I find this more interesting, but this is it's a vertebrae from a case that I worked on where a woman was, she was cut, her throat was cut, but I have a replica of her bone. And for some reason, having a replica of her bone is more interesting to me than having the real bone so I just thought that was kind of cool. And I related to exactly what you were saying. What about on the software side? I imagine you're using a number of different pieces of software, or is there something more dedicated to forensic facial reconstruction?
So we use a pre-existing software called Freeform Modeling Plus, which is a geomagic software. It's kind of used within engineering and with model making, and lots of applications. And then we combine that with a database that we've built in terms of anatomical structures, but also in terms of feature scans. So it's a combination of our database and this pre-existing system that is used for the reconstruction element. And so we separate it in FaceLab, we separate it into reconstruction, which is the building of the shape of the face from the skull, and then depiction, which is adding all the textures and presenting it. So we build and do the reconstruction in this system, and then we take it out of that system into one of a number of different systems to produce a depiction. So we might just take it into a photo editing software like Photoshop and produce something in 2D, or we might take it into a 3D software like Maya or ZBrush to produce something in 3 dimensions. Or we might take it into another CGI or animation package to move it around. So, and much of that last bit is not what I do, because I'm too old to learn those new tricks, and other people do the CGI texturing in 3D. I still do the 2D stuff and the reconstruction, but there's lots of options now. And then, of course, we can also print it out in 3D and it's a physical head and paint it and add prosthetic eyes and wigs, which is what we did with Richard III.
Right. So in terms of research and accuracy. There's I guess a couple of things, and I was really surprised at how much information is actually out there in this particular area today with respect to making comparisons and having multiple people create the same reconstruction and then making comparisons that way. You've also done a ton of work on looking at tissue depth and how accurately it can be determined and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I've heard you mention once about the accuracy of, for example, the tissue depth, and that it's like a couple of millimeters or something like that. What can you tell us about how well people perform today when they're trying to get the tissue depth on a skull?
Well, there's lots of different data sets that we can use now. So again, when I first started out there, we were mostly reliant on quite old human dissection studies, or a few new ultrasound studies that had come out, or x-rays. Now, of course, with the advances in clinical imaging and CT scans and even MR scans, we get a lot more living data, and then that data is used from all over the world. So I guess there's two different theories in terms of how the tissue depths are used. Either that an area, a data set is chosen that's most relevant to the skull that's being reconstructed. So for example, if you're doing a Viking, then you might choose some Scandinavian data because that would be the closest thing. Or there's another train of thought that actually those differences are not that important, and all of the data should be averaged together, and we're only using them as guides anyway, and the skull is the most important thing. And I think the second is true. We do tend to choose the most appropriate sets of data, but actually I think the differences between them are not as great as the differences between each skull, and the skull is the most important thing. The one time I would say that tissue depths are important for children, because those tissue depths change quite quickly over short periods of time. So using sets of data then can be quite useful in terms of producing an accurate depiction.
Okay. There's a paper that I have up here that you can see. This was one that you did in the Journal of Forensic Science in March 2012. And
with our South Korean colleagues.
That's right. You can see there's a whole list of them here. So, and many papers. I'm not sure if there's a regular team of people that you keep working with, but hey, good on you. The more papers, the better. But in this one, I found it interesting that statistically, most of the landmarks that you chose fell within a really good range between different observers, except for there was 5 landmarks in particular, and even then, experience played a factor. And so I'm curious about what particular areas were difficult for some of the newer people.
So, well, one of the issues is aligning a soft tissue landmark with a bony landmark. Mm-hmm. So for example, the base underneath the chin, there's a soft tissue landmark, and then obviously underneath the bony chin, there's a hard tissue landmark. And those landmarks are aligned for the sake of these types of measurements, but actually may not be in exactly the same alignment for every individual because of the shape of the chin and because of the amount of tissue there. So and because the measurements are taken on the person rather than on the bone, then aligning that can be based on experience. And the more experienced a practitioner is, the better they are at finding those points, aligning them and taking the measurement. So I think that's where the error rate comes in with the measuring. And then obviously the same thing applies when you're doing the reconstruction, because we tend to use little pegs or something similar, virtual pegs in our digital system that represent that tissue depth. But of course, you've got to make sure you put them in at 90 degrees to the surface of the bone, because that's how the measurement's taken, and the bone's not flat in the same area. So that can be a tricky thing to do as well. So I think that's where the error applies. The differences between individuals tend to be more related to age and a little bit to sex, but mostly I'd say the skull is the primary factor for face shape.
I see. Have you done any work or looked at anything that looks at shape, like morphometrics and this sort of thing, or is that a different approach other than looking at landmarks?
So in terms of algorithms, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I haven't. It's not my area really, but there have been some studies that have been done. And one of the problems I think with the morphometric approach for us as practitioners is it doesn't give you any standard at the end. It finds a relationship, but when you've got a skull, you need a standard to help you predict something. So knowing a relationship like that doesn't always help.
Yeah.
Practically.
Yeah. Right. Is it possible, or do you have access to certain databases nowadays? Like, is there more like CT databases and things like that that researchers and practitioners can work from?
Yeah, so I don't know about CT. CT is a bit more difficult because there are ethical issues associated with the research, partly because of radiation, and then partly because of the ethics of how they're taken. And the UK has much more stringent ethics sometimes than other countries, so they're not always freely available, other than for the purposes that they were collected. But there has been a lot of researchers that have now collected face scan data from all over the world, and many of those databases are freely available for researchers. For example, there's a collection that was done at Alderhay Hospital in Liverpool that is freely available for researchers within academia. So, and it's like thousands of scans, 3D scans of people's faces. So I think it depends on when they were collected and the ethics, but more and more of them are becoming open access for people.
Oh, interesting. I wanted to ask you about some of the cases that you've worked on. And there's this one here that was from Scotland, Glenrothes.
And Rothis.
Glenrothes. There you go. See,
Yes.
you got to. Okay, I'm going to say this out loud. I actually watched the video on pronunciation before this because
Did you?
I'm
Well
going to
done.
screw it up. I knew I was going to screw it up. That's okay. You can correct me. I'm okay with that. What can you tell us about this particular case?
Oh, it's a very good question. Now you're testing me because I have an awful memory these days, especially in lockdown. So this was recently identified, this one, wasn't it? This was a case, I think it was a cold case from a few years ago, and the individual was found, I can't read it, sorry. I know it was
It looks
found.
like an estate. So it says that, oh no, actually it's September 20. The remains were found on September 2020 inside a unit on the estate of Whitehill Road. And yeah, so
Yeah, so I mean, it was a relatively straightforward for us case because it was human remains. They really had absolutely no clue as to who it was. We produced a reconstruction. He's got some nice characteristic detail, like his nose. He was identified, and then I believe someone was arrested. I don't know if they've been convicted, but someone was arrested for his murder.
oh, wow, interesting. There was another one here as well. Let me see if I can bring it up. This is the is it Gloucestershire?
Yeah.
Yeah. This one here. So there's skeletal remains in a woodland off the A4119. What is the same kind of thing? Are they fairly straightforward? Because
Yeah, I mean, for the most difficult thing for us normally in forensic cases are when there's bits missing, or when we've got to estimate areas or put fragmented skulls back together. And actually, is the one thing that is more difficult digitally than physically. Bone seems to slot together much better when it's in your hands than when it's in a 3D scan on the screen. But that aside, it is more difficult when you've got to have fragmented skulls to reassemble them. And then I guess, you know, if there's something characteristic, then that's the perfect end result, because then that's what usually the thing that gets the person recognized.
right.
I don't think that one's been identified, has it?
This one I don't think so.
No, I
No.
think that's still outstanding. So
Yeah, I believe when I was reading this one, it's still
yeah,
unidentified. So that's still going on there.
yeah.
So let's talk about some of the well, let's say some of the ones that you're most famous for, or you get a lot of attention for, which are some of the historical or some of the archaeological cases. So, for example, Richard the well, how about we talk about
Richard III.
Yeah, let's talk about Richard III. Unless we go back to the older, I believe Robert the Bruce was even older.
Older period, yeah.
Yeah, so he was what, King of Scots. I have 1306 to about 1329. And tell us about that one. The reason I like this one too is you did something different because you actually did some things animated with voice. And so maybe you can tell me about it, maybe leading up to that.
No, so that's a different one. So the Robert the Bruce one was done in 3D, wasn't animated. Robert Burns, who is a Scots poet,
it was Robert Burns.
Period,
That's
is
right.
the one that was animated.
You're correct. Yeah.
Do you want me to talk about Burns?
Yes, please.
Okay, so what we wanted to do with Burns, so there are a number of copies of his skull that are housed in different places, because when he was moved, when his remains were moved, a cast was made, a mould of the skull was made, and then those moulds found their way to different museums. There's one in Dumfries, which is where he's from, which is where we got the cast from. So we produced a facial depiction quite a long time ago in 3D from the skull, and also from some of the silhouette portraits that were done of him, because not all of the skull was present. And then for a while we were talking about it would be really good, because he's was known as being such a charismatic person, and that his poetry and his performance were really important. And that kind of performance of Scots poetry is really important in Scotland. And we were talking with a Scots poet called Rab Wilson, who was really interested in getting an authentic portrait of Burns that wasn't just a static image. So, and he's this brilliant Scots performer. So what we did was to record him performing a Burns poem, and we found the shortest one we could find, which is called To a Mouse, which is 3 minutes long. And he performed that. We recorded him in 4D. So in other words, a 3D scan, but with time as well. So 4D motion of him was captured. And then we tried to put his movement and voice onto the head of Burns, so that Burns moved with his facial expressions and performance, and also his voice. And he's also from Dumfries. So, in terms of age and and performance, he was as authentic as we could get for Robert Burns, and that's what we did. It's not perfect. I don't like it 100%. It was our first chance, opportunity to do something in 4D, and we learned a lot from doing it. But it's kind of cool to see a talking Burns head.
Yeah. Now, was that one? He died in 1796. So was there a lot of good information? Was the skull preserved really well?
Well, the skull, we didn't see the original skull, just the cast of it. And because they were primarily interested in phrenology, like the cranium, the cast was only this bit, and then we lost the lower jaw, which was irritating because we had most of it and then not this last little bit. But then he'd had some, during his life, because he was famous during his lifetime, he'd had some portraits done. So there was obviously portrait information. But then he'd also had, those silhouette cutouts that people get done, or silhouette paintings where you see someone in profile. Yeah. He had one of those done. So we used that along with the skull to get the lower part of the face, because they're usually done against a wall with a silhouette. So they work pretty well in terms of proportions. So we used a number of things. The portraits, the actual paintings of him, are quite different by different people. There's one that he liked. That doesn't mean it was the most accurate, but there was one that he liked and that we used. And of course, we used those for the skin color and the hair and the hairstyle. And he had a mole on his face. All of those details were taken from the portraits.
Oh, super cool. Now, Richard III, he was king of England for just a couple of years, like 1483, and then he was killed in 1485. But what's intriguing is he was found in a car park, right? So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. This king is, well, I guess he lost the battle, and maybe they just said, they left him for whatever. Just tell us about that one. I'm trying to imagine all kinds of issues there, but
yeah. So I mean, you're right in that history is written by the winners. He was a loser, and but he wasn't just left in a car park. The car park was a contemporary. Underneath the car park, there was the remains of a friary, And that some very clever local historians and academics got together and worked out where this friary was based on the old maps, and then decided that this car park had been built over the top of one part of the friary, which was probably where he was buried. So that's why there was a big dig, and fantastically they found his remains.
That's incredible. Yeah.
I know, it is incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reconstruction.
All that they have no idea. Sorry, say again.
No, I was just going to say I mean, he was killed, so I don't know. Was his skull more or less intact?
He had a lot of damage to all of his body, not just his head. I mean, so there was. I mean, there's a big report on it, and again, I didn't do this. The osteologist did this, and the weapon experts. But he had damage to a number of different parts of his body from weapons at and around the time of his death. And he had scoliosis to his spine, which he'd lived with during his life. He had a number of wounds that the osteologists think were post-mortem as a way of humiliating him, wounds that were inflicted on him possibly by the public or by other soldiers as a way of humiliating his remains. So there was lots of wounds to him and lots of damage. Fantastically for us, though, the skull was pretty much intact. There were some injuries to the head, but not that made any difference to us in terms of the facial depiction.
Okay. And then Robert the Bruce. So he was, that was 1306 to 1329 when he died. What about his condition and the reconstruction there?
Well, so that was a really interesting case because, again, we didn't have his remains. So his tomb is thought to have been found in Dunfermline Abbey in Scotland in the 19th century. And then the remains were reburied and covered, thought to have mostly have been reburied and covered in like bitumen. So the remains are completely inaccessible. And then there are lots of stories about where parts of his body have ended up, that they were taken and his heart was buried somewhere else and his skull maybe somewhere. Anyway, we don't have his remains, or that parts of them have turned up, but I don't know the details of whether or not they're actually viable. So the only thing we had to work on was a cast of the skull that was made when the tomb was emptied. A report was done by the anatomist then, by a couple of anatomists then. So a full report, there were anthropometry, there were drawings of the skull, and then a fantastic skull cast was made. And again, a number of casts in bronze were made that have gone to different places. There's one in the Hunterian Museum, for example, in Glasgow. And that's the one that we worked on. So we were working from a cast rather than the original skull. But one of the controversies with Robert the Bruce is whether or not his skull shows signs of leprosy during life. So there is something unusual going on around his face, and what's happened to the skull is consistent with what happens during leprosy. But we'll never know because we don't have the actual remains, and it's too difficult to tell from the skull whether this is damage post-mortem or whether it's leprosy during life. And so what we did was we produced two different reconstructions, one with leprosy and one without. And then we also worked with the local historians, local to Glasgow, at the university there, who was interested in how Robert the Bruce's status continued to be very strong. That if he'd had leprosy, that he wouldn't have had the same status that he did have when he died. So he was very convinced, and a lot of other people too, that if he did have leprosy, the signs on his face would have been quite mild. And it's possible that that's the case because the signs of leprosy vary hugely in a wide range. So the leprosy we did show was quite mild presenting in terms of his face, although he did have what's called a saddleback nose, where the nose kind of drops into the aperture, but mostly the rest of it can go from anything that looks like a bit of a rash, which I'm guessing in 14th century Scotland wasn't that unusual, to something that is really quite destructive to the face. And clearly if it had been the latter, that would have affected his status.
Interesting.
Interesting case to do.
It is, absolutely. How does, when you're working on cases, especially when they're forensic identification cases, and I've heard you mention this in some of the talks, how does cognitive bias play a role in the work that you do?
Well, so this is one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in at the moment, because I think we need to be really careful with the depictions that we present, especially of ancient populations where we can't really make the same assumptions based on contemporary information. So there's lots of bias, I think, that often goes into these depictions. For example, I think depictions of women from the past are given very different looks to depictions of men. Men often have much more direct gaze, more aggressive facial expressions. Women tend to be much more indirect in terms of gaze, with much more passive expressions. All the assumptions that we have about contemporary gender identity seem to go into the depictions that are presented. And actually, I think we need to move away from that. I really love the depictions that are done that are really characterful. I love them. They look fantastic and they're really realistic. But I'm wary of doing that kind of work myself because of what it suggests about the person that we can't possibly know.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's especially true when we talk about things like population and ancestry, or race, which is something that I steer clear of completely. And how we choose to present skin colour, for example, on ancient Egyptians is a hugely controversial area. And the choices that we make when we do those presentations will affect what people think about those people, sometimes for decades. There are very good examples where early depictions have, Neanderthal is a great example, where the early depictions of Neanderthal dominated the academic discussion on Neanderthal long, until new evidence, mostly from DNA, suggested that it were actually completely different to this brutish, club swinging view that was from the 19th century. So, and that's entirely down to depictions that were based on very little evidence. So we need to be very careful, I think, about moving scientific theory into the depictions unless we're absolutely certain of it.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was remembering one of the early images of the Neanderthals, which is very ape-like. It's the only way I can describe it. Much more ape-like, much more prehistoric, let's call it. And then some of the more recent ones are much more human.
Very human, yeah. And the same with Kennewick Man, which I'm sure you're familiar with. There have been two depictions of Kennewick Man, one completely different from the other.
Mm-hmm.
And both have been very controversial in terms of what they suggest about population.
Yeah, interesting. So tell me, what is next for you? What areas of research are you focused on, or where do you think things will go? And I have a particular interesting question about artificial intelligence and that sort of thing, if you think that has any play in your area.
Yeah, so for me, I think the future is looking at the presentation of the information we have, both in terms of bias, but also in terms of what best to present for recognition levels in forensic scenarios. So that's one of the areas that I'm working on, some of that psychology link up that we talked about at the start. In terms of archaeology, I think the AI bit is going to play a big part. So we're already, you've already seen I'm sure some of the animations from software that you can do with your family photographs from the past. So the use of this within the archaeological world is going to become much more progressed, I think. And whilst there's problems with that for me, as I've mentioned, in terms of suggestions of personality, I think that kind of animation of faces is where it's going to go. And more than that, I think if we can predict how people would have interacted from what we know about their personality using AI, so that you could, for example, have a conversation with Richard III and he would answer you as Richard III based on what we know about him from his writings and what other people have written, then that would be amazing. And I think that's possible, not yet, but it will be in the future.
Yeah, that'd be pretty amazing. Star Trek, the holodeck. What was
Yeah,
that? The Next
yeah,
Generation. They go on the holodeck and they start. Yeah, they should show me, some historical figure, and then they start chatting away. That's super interesting.
yeah.
Well, listen, thank you so much. I think we'll
Sure.
stop it here. We're getting on in time, and I think you're doing fascinating work. I really admire all the research, the papers, the publication. I know how hard it is to sometimes do that kind of work, especially the writing. I give you credit for all the writing. That's the difficult part.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah, but hey, hang back. I want to ask you a few questions, but once again, fantastic work and all the best to you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
All right, cheers. All right, folks. Well, that does it for this particular episode. That's super intriguing stuff there. Next week, I'm going to have Paul Coley. He's the founder and CEO of Scent Evidence Canine. And scent is a form of evidence that we often ignore or omit, unless it's sort of hitting you right in the nose. So he's going to be talking to us about scent and how they're using scent dogs to help in missing person investigations. So on that note, hey, I want to wish everyone a really great day. And hopefully we'll see you next week, Thursday at 2 p.m. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.